I want to welcome my panel up here today. We're going to be, as Jeff said, we're going to talk about audit compliance. Not as deep as Angel might want us to go into it. But, you know, as we've been talking about throughout the day, the identity has never been so strategically important. We see this in evidence of security breaches, audit findings. Many agencies still are struggling to answer who has access to what. Who are my privileged users? And Diana's going to tell us how CBP has been doing some of the access certifications and having some success there. We have increased legislation, privacy concerns, more complex policies and frameworks. You know, as we heard earlier today, the ICAM modernization policy, you know, marks a historic achievement for us as new guidance that we can take and strengthen our identity posture moving forward, where, you know, this becomes important in answering that who has access to what. But it's not just information systems, it's physical access as well. It's the boundaries, it's the credential, being able to have the credential, as we heard from the CGI team and Ross earlier. You know, that data we have collected in the CDM master user record, you know, that's all important. That's all visibility, all things we have to report. You know, Ross brought up the high value assets earlier. You know, that's another thing. I believe it was 2 years ago they did the data call for high value assets, maybe a year ago. And one of the things they found that agencies, you know, were having a hard time understanding the weaknesses that they had found in their high value systems. And they were noted in enterprise risk management, access controls, authentications. Sounds familiar, right? And I assume that's been the driver for you know, the progress that we're making going forward. You know, the DoD this year released the digital modernization strategy. You know, that included some new ICAM objectives to answer specific things like audit from the recent fire audit. And we might touch on some of that, but that's huge. You know, there's all this activity going on, not only from a security perspective, you know, we talk about zero trust, changing the paradigm, but there's also this audit and compliance thing that still lingers around for all of us that we have to answer in government. So, you know, we're going to hit that. And then the other thing, what's driving this? We have the risk management framework, the NIST cybersecurity framework, all these different policies that create this complexity, things that are hard to understand, hard to manage. And we have folks from EY, Accenture, you know, Deloitte, all the SailPoint partners are these guys that are doing these audits and translating solutions that all come back to the identity. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. Jeff introduced everyone. Today we've heard a lot about IT modernization, transformation, this new zero trust paradigm, in how we're thinking about security. My question to the panel openly, keep this in your mind, I think everyone here's, how does this affect security, compliance, audit reporting, and visibility? How do we manage this problem? What needs to be done to ease the audit pain, to ease the move to digital transformation as it pertains to identity? So I'd like to start out with a question, really get the drivers out of the way. And look at risk management framework, cybersecurity framework, FISMA, you know, all these things that drive us towards creating metrics, compliance frameworks, security frameworks, and ask the question, you know, how important is identity to this? Angel, in your perspective, you know, as an auditor, what's the importance there? How important is it to have a strong identity program?
Absolutely, and thanks for having it, Frank. And just because you already gave me the title of the auditor, just as we continue moving forward, keep in mind auditors are people too, right? We have feelings,
No,
so let's go.
No, you're not.
So let's go easy. But great question. I would tell you whether it's CSF, FISMA, A123, HVA, what do they all have in common? Access, right? So as we think of, you know, the complexity of the regulations, we heard Dana talking about it this morning. thinking through, how do you inventory this? How do you know what you have in your enterprise and how you're protecting it? And also based on risk. Oftentimes, I feel like that's a buzzword that goes around a lot of enterprise risk management. And that's where I think where there's a lot of room to be made in the sense of we were very focused on the technology aspect of it, right? A lot of zeros and ones, you talk about vulnerability, findings, but what does that mean to the enterprise and to the mission, right? So as we think through all the different regulations, whether it's NIST or even on the commercial sector, making sure you have a good handle on what's out there, how are you protecting it, what's the highest risk data, right? And ultimately, how does that align to the business and your mission? That's what it comes down to, and that's what it boils down to. And truthfully, that's where we see the most successful audits.
Thank you. Ross, anything to add there on HVAs? I know you had to jump off that topic pretty quick. You were running out of time. Anything you want to add there?
HVAs have had audit findings, right? And CISA has been trying to help agencies first assess the risk based on their HVAs, make sure the agencies are identifying HVAs, and then doing risk and vulnerability assessments on those things, right? So what CDM would like to do is help them actually mitigate risks that they're finding, right? And even just assessing the risk in some of those environments, the thing that we do at CDM helps them identify, what type of authenticators do they have, and we'll be able to help measure those things. Right now, CDM is kind of broad, right? And that's kind of table stakes, right? So, Angel, you can look at an agency and you can see if they're using PIV cards for their employees and contractors, and that gives you a baseline for understanding what that agency's risk posture is around identity, right? As opposed to someone that hasn't made that effort to do the proofing and do the vetting to get the PIV card, which kind of tells you as an auditor, you already know that they're not in as strong a position as they could be, right? But as you apply that to HVAs, that helps you determine what levers you have to pull when you're auditing the environment to know what they should be doing based upon their own policies or based upon generic policies that you're auditing against, right?
Yeah, and Ross, you brought up a great point. Often enough, I think we're doing a better job in collaborating between the auditors and the auditee. And what I mean by that is, when the auditor shows up to the front door, it is management's responsibility to say, here is my risk, here are my controls, and here's what I'm doing to protect this. And it's not the other way around. It's not. There's been way too many times where I've gone into a meeting and they say, what do you want to know? Right? You tell me what you mean by privileged users. Privileged users to me completely means something else just because I came out of another meeting from 2 minutes ago from a different client. So keep that in mind, right? This is your enterprise, this is your data, you drive the conversation on risk. And ultimately, without good access controls, you're really not having a good conversation, right? So it is powerful when we have great conversations with clients to say, here is our HVAs. Here are controls, here are the risk points. This is how we actually operate. Oh, and by the way, our business is set up this way, and this is why we have to do certain things that maybe in the cookie cutter auditor world doesn't, work well. When you start having those conversations, it's a great dialogue.
So that's outstanding. I asked this question a little differently in the earlier panel. I asked about stakeholder involvement. And that was more in the relation to how we implement these changes. The ICAM modernization strategy calls for changes in how we're doing identity proofing, things like that, right? Access controls. But how critical is stakeholder involvement across the organization for audits? There's a lot of folks that get involved in this. CISO, compliance officer, application owners, the individual manager. This is an all hands on deck thing. When we go through these assessments, the inventories, like Darren talked about earlier, we got to inventory. So, how do you inventory all of these things? How do you perform these audits? And Angel, you were just hitting on it, right? The understanding. So if you guys could all take a swing at what, from your perspective, how critical is that stakeholder involvement, and what successes, failures have you seen with and without it? Who wants to go first? Okay.
So as a CISO, when you were talking about all the things, the areas, FIRE, risk management framework, zero trust, compliance, privacy. I was doing a mental check because all of those areas are in my portfolio. So working across the Air Force, where we have over 800,000 users, about 20-something thousand or more privileged users. And so trying to make sure that we cover all those areas, talking to the stakeholders and getting their buy-in, not from an IT perspective, but really understanding their business, what is their model that they're using to assess risk in their portfolio. And so I spent an awful amount of time working across the services, working with the stakeholders, working with industry to ensure that we're capturing all of those things. We have a lot going on in the Air Force when it comes to identity management and understanding where our gaps and vulnerabilities are. And so being able to have those conversations across the Air Force is one thing that I'm working on across for FY20 as well.
Brian, Diana, I know you guys have just gone through, shared with me some success you had with a recent audit. How important was stakeholder involvement in that? And did it help or did it make it worse?
When SailPoint was purchased or brought into Brian, there really wasn't stakeholder buy-in. And he and I have been together many years. So it was like, why don't you come help with SailPoint? I'm like, what are we doing? Okay. So for us, we have 3 different program offices that own SailPoint. We have a financial program office, we have a business owner, and I work in the program office that does implementation. So we have buy-in at a very high level. All the SESers have bought in. You're familiar with ALMA. It's ALMA system. So our marching orders were no NFRs. That was the bottom line. So when we talk about SailPoint, we talk about implementing it, which we had audit meetings every week. There was no question. I was able to move along and say, RAC said, or we're a law enforcement agency. We've been taking a lot of hits lately. We're not very popular. And there are a lot of hard people who work very hard to get us where we are. But in that, we're very respectful of our data. I mean, it's law enforcement. We have anything from immigration to court records. So to get a stakeholder buy-in, and the breaches, we've experienced those, is easier to say, okay, we're gonna do it. But then when you sit down with the PMs and you sit down with the technical people and say, okay, we're SailPoint, we're here, here's what we need to do. No, you're not doing that. The education from an audit perspective, from a technical perspective, from the need to have it. We're going to implement real-time access. And if you are not real-time, you will not have it. And it's painful, but we also have proven to them you can get access instantly. You're not waiting 45 minutes or 2 days or 2 weeks. So it is a thought process, it's a mindset to change. I think our biggest challenge has been in changing the mindset. SailPoint is a 180. Supervisors give you roles. You don't get to say, I want this. So changing that to say to supervisors, make sure your supervisor's correct, you're gonna lose access, and we do take away access. If a supervisor doesn't approve it, RAC, yes. So we are fortunate in that we have 3 SESers who support us in this, but when you have developers and technical folk who are used to just jumping in, they have their access, and you say, we're taking it. Yeah. It's like, what? And then usually I have to tell, well, we're taking it. So to get the support to be able to implement without so much pushback. And
that's all we did this year was, our entire focus with SailPoint was just audits this year. We started in February, and that was 100% of our focus on all the financial systems.
And
we had executive support, we had 12. Thousands of people were recertified that had never been recertified before through SailPoint or in any automated process. But you need to have that C-level push, because when you show up in someone else's identity shop and say, I got this identity tool and I'm gonna show you how it's done, you're gonna run into a little bit of resistance unless someone behind you is helping clear the way. So that stakeholder involvement from the top, that this audit will be successful and this will be the tool we're using, is very important.
So any recommendations on how, someone that hasn't gone through an audit might take that first step? When we think of this, and I mean with the SailPoint platform, is something that you guys, encroached on and said, hey, we got to do this. How do you get started?
Connect to everything.
Love you, Brian.
True statement.
Well, if you don't know what's out there, you can't recertify anybody. You can't do the access management piece. So you have to wire up SailPoint to all the identity stores you have in the enterprise and build that master user record so you can have that single pane where you can see all the privileges and entitlements. If you don't have that, you're just relying on someone else to tell you, like, don't worry, I got this.
Or here's my spreadsheet.
So it took us a little time to get all the service accounts hooked up to the back-end identity stores.
But not SailPoint time, it was our policy
Yeah, it wasn't
side.
SailPoint
As
as much as it
Kathy,
was. Yeah.
Kathy
Yeah.
said this morning, that all the connections are there out of the box. We've used flat files. I think we've probably had any connection that SailPoint has. And most people, when we sit down with the teams of whatever application it is, well, you're not going to be able to get our data. Oh, I bet we can. And we do. And I think in the biggest thing with our 12 systems that we tackled, getting that education to say, I had one guy say, well, you're the fourth research tool. What makes you think you're any better? Okay, well, SailPoint's not a research tool. We're working on that for the audit, but wait till we show you what else it does. So he's one of our loyal customers now.
Yes.
We've won a few
He's been
over.
converted.
Yeah, he's been converted.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a big part of it. The education, again, educate audits, educate what SailPoint does, why it's different.
And it bailed a lot of people out, let's be honest.
For NFRs.
A lot of people.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. The Department of Defense has been busy this year with audits. The results, the findings of the fire audit. 48%, I think, of the findings were IT access controls. I am assuming there's a lot going on in DoD to shore that up. What are some of the things in the new strategy that you guys identified as areas to prevent that from happening again? Obviously, at a much larger scale than 12 applications. So how do you look at this at such a broad scale?
Yeah, so I work in the cybersecurity deputate of the CIO. So the audit isn't my direct responsibility, which is good because I think we got enough on our plate already. But we've been partnering since the beginning of this because we recognize that access control is one of the core cybersecurity controls in the risk management framework, and so we've been busy working on what is the infrastructure required to improve that over time. And then all of a sudden we have this huge, secretary level, charge call to say, hey, we need to get going on this. So it's provided a lot of impetus for doing the things that we are already tracking as necessary. I think though, from an implementation perspective, DoD is in a different place. Where there's a lot of component level acquisition ongoing that many of you probably been watching pretty carefully. What I think the OSD charge there is, we need to make sure that the data is available so that organizations can compare access to get after that segregation of duties problems. So no one component can solve sort of the access control challenges for an audit on its own. There has to be a significant amount of sort of infrastructure in place, services, standards-based, because this is the reality is that each of the components is going to come up with a different tool. So, for the audience here, we want to make sure that we're maintaining those open interfaces and we're coming up with some standardized approaches so that we can all work together. So that's an important thing. If you happen to have your phone out, and I see a bunch of people looking at them already, download that DoD digital modernization strategy on page 30. I'll save you the time of looking it up. But if you look down in there, we're trying to go after a data-centric approach to identity data, which includes supporting many of those things. We're trying to move to a shared services environment to drive adoption. The specifically called out is supporting consistent monitoring and logging. So, and we put in there the generic sort of like for insider threats and cybersecurity threats, but people doing bad things in financial systems is an insider threat, but we have much more specific terminology in the mission area, and I think that's really I would say an important part of the DoD's approach is that the financial statement audit is an important use case, critical, right? We have to get that right, but I think the approach is we need to make sure that our investments and our policies and our infrastructure is able to support that kind of focus in any mission area. And that's not in any mission area like in any component, but any mission area across the defense business or warfighting intelligence enterprises. So that's a big mark on the wall, but it helps keep our heads up when we're trying to solve specific problems.
Right, and I would add that we also, following the DoD, the CIO and the CFO have aligned and partnered to make sure that we are doing the right things when it comes to the fire audits and helping each other from the DoD level push those partnerships across every service. We all have to come to the table. Both are held accountable to be able to answer those questions as to why we still have those NFRs and when are we going to fix them.
It's a challenge. I don't envy anyone that has the scale of systems and things. It's tremendous and a huge body of work that you guys do, and thank you very much. Moving on, one of the things that causes these findings is lack of automation. We're still granting access manually in a lot of places. We have paper forms that we're filling out, or maybe electronic forms, but they're not connected to the provisioning system. Therefore, we can't do automated deprovisioning. Kathy Hall, I mentioned it earlier today, access requests. Sajanya in the session prior to this talked about it as well. When we automate this process, it makes the deprovisioning, the segregation of duties, Sajanya talked about the access policy or the policies in SailPoint. That reduces that risk. So as you look forward to, if you could have a crystal ball, would you see making those changes? Diana, are you enforcing policies on access? Is that something that you guys are going to look towards with the CDM data? Within the DoD, there's several different conversations, and I probably aren't as familiar as I am with them. Those things, are really going to be beneficial. So I'd like to hear your perspective on whether or not that's something you've even thought of today, or was today the first time you heard of it? That it could prevent some of those findings?
Just kidding. I think you can't get there until you start to focus on having one provisioning engine. As long as you still have these islands of identity out there with their own back-end and provisioning methodologies, you're not going to get there. So one of the focuses we've got for next year, we did a lot of help for these financial systems from without. We would take their data, run their research campaigns. It was very effective for them. But we want to get them using SailPoint to do all the access provisioning, because then we can deprovision them. Then there goes the audit finding, because now we have the artifact. And if it's done in one tool, then it makes the audit process a lot simpler. The auditors don't show up and say, well, what are you using? How are you using it? There's one way you implement it and one way you provision access and deprovision access. So that's the way we're going to be heading at CBP, God willing.
I think the hardest thing that what we did initially is analysis. I've told you I have my FABs, facts and analysis brag sheet in the 12 systems, and they're large. They're not little ones. We've cleaned up 2.8 million records in less than 9 months. We've done 2 recertifications of over 26,000 users. We've done it twice already this year. But when Brian and I started, it was, we have AD, we have web tele, we have something else, and we have something else. So we put together 11 different attribute silos that we now have into SailPoint. And we also have the DHS ties. So for any one person, no social security number, we're looking at 50, 60 attributes per person. So this is his number 15. He's 14 for 14 in his request of what he wants done. And he wants to get rid of our paper form. So I'm sure that's your first priority come
No more
January.
paper.
Right, no more paper. All access will be through SailPoint, and and we will enforce it. Because we've run into a problem, which I'm sure everybody has, close your ears. You walk down the hall, Ross, I need access to this because and you're like, oh, okay. And I go, it's okay. And there's no paper trail. And the auditor comes in and says, okay, I think I got that in the hallway. Or an email. And then that person leaves. So that's come to a screeching halt.
You mentioned something just there about the tie. And I got to say that DHS is in a pretty good situation because they worked on this problem a very long time, and I'm proud to say I was at DHS before, and we identified tools like these virtual directories that can really help you get a view of your entire enterprise, and that only worked through. You talked earlier about stakeholder engagement. DHS formed an executive steering committee that had all the CIOs participating, and that tie came as a result of that kind of work. So now I want to make a plug for 1917. It's exactly that kind of activity that OMB is talking about, that all agencies should have that kind of multi-stakeholder engagement so that you can get to the point where you guys are, which is a wonderful place to be, but it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of executive sponsorship. You have to find your champions. Financial systems are a great place to start this and move forward because they have really important and they have better knowledge of their systems than most other systems anyway. So you can move forward in an effective manner when you target that kind of environment. Look for those kind of stakeholders when you're looking for successful places to make a big move. I know we talked about DoD, right? I mean, that's exactly kind of one of the forces that's driving this, right? So use those force multipliers, right?
And for those of you who aren't familiar with what the DHS tie is there's 99 attributes in the tie. So DHS collects it from all its components. So ICE and Secret Service and every CBP. We have external users. We collaborate with ICE and our sister components. In addition, we have foreign nationals. We're getting ready to tackle that. So in this tie, depending on who we need to identify, we can get that information right from DHS. It's all fed, so we pull it back. And this is where the privacy comes in. There's a lot of paperwork to get our PTAs done and our PIAs done, and we do that. But it's been incredible of what the tie can provide us, where we're not going to ICE to have a connection and have a connection with this one. It is a consistent pull-in. Again, no social security number. So I think that was our first. Mm-hmm. We were connected to the tie. We said, okay, we'll start there. And then what was lacking, we went and picked up 10 more.
Right. So I think it's somebody mentioned earlier about when somebody leaves, or how do you know? So we needed to have a place we could trust that was, this person has definitively been deprovisioned from the enterprise. So that for us was the tie, because that fed in the card issuance system, it fed in the federated AD, and we can say with certainty, well, almost 100% certainty, that this person that's sitting in this legacy system does not belong here. And you need to have that reference point, that authoritative source for that information. If you're not using SailPoint as the authoritative source, we're at least aggregating all the authoritative sources we know of. And so we can act as that proxy,
Right. And that gets back to the point Sujanya was making about using the data, operationalizing that data that we have in the CDM master user record, or building in the DoD identity profiles. Having attributes that we can take action on. I've been doing identity projects in the federal government since 1997. just for a couple of years now. And I've never seen so much data available to a federal agency that they can take and operationalize and make smart decisions. The opportunity is there today for access control decisions, as Dana was talking about with the AI platform, just being able to identify outliers. There's all these different things that this data will do for us that we have in automation, just data-driven automation. I'm sure that makes the auditors happy. I would assume as an auditor, when you go in and there's manual processes for provisioning and deprovisioning, your ears perk up and expect to have findings. But when you go into an environment where there is automation, I would assume, and I'd love to have your opinion on this, does automation and this provisioning reduce the amount of findings that you have in segregation of duties or stale accounts? I mean, think back to maybe some of the audits you did. I'm only guessing. I'm not an auditor. So would love to hear your perspective.
No,
I'm human.
Absolutely, great question. And frankly, there's two different risks, right? There's a manual risk and there's an automated risk. And frankly, I will be lying to you if I told you that if you automate things, you're going to have less findings. That's not the case. But the reason why is because we've actually seen it where you're looking at RPA, right? RPA has become a thing within DoD. They're starting to use RPA to do key processes of a financial transaction. But what happened is once we started analyzing how did you program that bot to do something, who has access to the bot, then we start looking at, can you override those controls, right? Are you capturing all the data complete and accurate, right? Like those are the buzzwords from the auditor. So keep in mind, from automation, we look at it from a different risk perspective. It shouldn't be taken as it ultimately will reduce the number of findings or NFRs. It does help. Without a doubt. And then going back to the manual, anytime we hear, we're having to manually recertify thousands of users, it automatically, right? Just by human nature, creates a risk lens that we have to start looking through. But I would tell you, beyond the audit, from an automation perspective, the audit, it's just a byproduct, right? Like of good hygiene, good processes. And what we've seen is where we've actually taken those hours, those manual hours, and being put back into the mission. To us, that is the benefit, right? And I get it, whether it's a financial statement audit, whether it's a FISMA audit, we have to look at it from that lens. But where we see the benefits is ultimately taking those automated processes and saying, now what can I do with the time that I have, right? So hopefully, Frank, I know it's probably not the answer that you wanted to hear, that it's gonna decrease, but it's just a different lens. And I always come back and tell you that the audit results are just a byproduct of good hygiene and protecting your data.
I think one of the aspects of this, I don't know if you can hear me yet. There's a maturity model, right? There's a spectrum. Everybody starts somewhere, and depending on where you've been, you could have had good processes that are intense and manual. You could have been partially enabled by a locally developed solution. You could be anywhere. You could be sitting on a legacy platform. Somebody was talking about Cloud 1.0, right? IBM 360 mainframes. There's all these different contexts, and each system has a specific role in these processes. And depending on where they go, if you don't have a technology available to you, right, you can't do automation and figure out how to raise the bar. Yeah. So it's kind of like you've got to measure your investment so that you can increase the reach of your policy, right? And I think that those are things that we're working through, and it really isn't a maturity model. If you can be effective and not have to rely on some expensive technology, then go for it, right? Absolutely. We're not trying to raise the bar beyond what is required. So we have to be careful about that. And really, those are supposed to be business decisions. Whether it's modernizing a piece of IT, whether it's making the investment in a capability, and we've got to bring all those factors together, and it does take that multifunctional sort of partnership in order to plot that. And I think that's why I'm really optimistic and bullish on DoD's ICAM strategy because it really is pointing ICAM at supporting the National Defense Strategy's 3 top-level initiatives, and then the 4 focus areas in the DoD digital modernization strategy. And I could run through those if we had time to burn.
Real quick, you just reminded me of one thing. This is a success story, and we've heard about collaboration, and something that I propose to you guys is collaborate with your auditors as well. And I'll tell you a success story. We actually, and this is about automation, we had a client come to us and said, hey, look, we're actually gonna do RPA in this one process. Would you guys mind providing us feedback? We ultimately came to the conclusion that your process by design it's flawed. So you were going to automate a flawed process. So what happened there, frankly, we had a great conversation where the auditee looked at us as the value add, right? To say, hey, look, I'm not asking you how to design my controls. I'm not telling you or asking you to tell me what to do. But as a business, we want to share this with you, right? And then we also have a responsibility to tell you, if you're probably going to do something that we see a risk in, we should share that with you. So as you think about collaboration and quote unquote auditors or passing an audit, just know that as a team, right? The auditors are also part of that team.
Yeah, I was going to say that, CDM has as we go into this phase 3, and then we just call phase 3 and 4, which is managed network security and data protection. One of the capability areas that we have is called design and build and security. And we suspect that there'll be ways that we can help agencies learn how to, as they adopt more automation, how to inspect the system that is performing that automation, right? To make sure that you're monitoring the versioning, the way those processes get built, right? I'm not trying to say we're going to do that next year, guys. Don't get all worried about it, right? This is a complicated kind of a model to do. But you're exactly right. As you automate more processes, you have to make the processes act the way you expect them to act. And there's risk if they don't, right? And your auditors can help you. In fact, just taking a good risk-based approach to viewing that automation, and not just, I'm trying to do this thing for these people, right? But you really have to take a good risk approach to all the things you do. So business enablement and risk management, they go hand in hand, and they have to go hand in hand. Because if you put something out there that's a business enabler that introduces risk, you'll lose credibility, you may lose money, you may lose assets, right? So you really have to do these things hand in hand.
And we have done that. We've already recertified SailPoint. That's one of my pet peeves. I will pass anything you put in front of me. That is gold. And so our documentation, we've already done our research. I have the button that I get to push for approvals. He does it.
You've been to client twice.
Yeah.
I still have that I still see it every day I log in.
Yes, done deal. But that's a true statement, because we came into this audit this year saying we have a tool and we stopped 4 NFRs and it worked beautifully, but we're going to get audited next year. I don't want to fail that audit. That would be horrible. Implement a tool that saves you 1 year and you fail the next. So you do have to look at what you're putting in place, and what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So we follow the same rules in the implementation, and that's where your privacy came in and all of our documentation. So yeah, you have to be a guardian of the guardians.
So audit is one thing. That's when we hope we've got it right. Things are working as they're supposed to. We hope we don't have any NFRs. But then we have a breach. And then we go into forensic mode. How important is having that identity governance platform, that identity profile, that identity context we talked about earlier today? How critical is that?
Was he reading my email earlier?
No.
From a law enforcement perspective, critical is not strong enough. When you're looking at court cases, when you're looking at insider threat, any breach, CBP has not been immune to certain things. I'm sure you all read the paper. If we cannot identify who, what, when, where, and how, and what happened and how long, we're dead in the water. So it is incredibly critical for us, not only from an audit standpoint, and as you say with the hygiene, just good housekeeping. I'd invite any audit for SailPoint. But if you don't have that ability to identify that vulnerability. We have 68,000 users around the world. We lose credibility, which I'd like to know how many people in this room think CBP has credibility, because you all do watch the news. And we have no value. DHS has no value. So identity for us is incredibly critical, which we're getting ready to implement immediately, some other processes. So, and I'm, even Montgomery County schools have had a problem. I don't think it has to be a law enforcement. I think anybody who has data, any hospital, any school, anybody's data is important. So knowing who accessed what, when, how, and what did they do, and have a log, and having an audible way to find that out and say, here's exactly what happened, in addition to being able to shut it down immediately. If you see that and you see data transfer that's terabytes that hasn't been in a change control, and you're like, okay, who is that and what are they doing? It's also critical to know what time it happened. If I work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and all of a sudden at 2 in the morning, I'm transferring terabytes of data, why is that? So to have that instant visibility and monitoring, that was brought up this morning as far as monitoring systems, and looking at who's doing what where, who is on your network, what are they doing, are they supposed to be there? So for zero trust, as an implementer, I give no access to anyone for any system. I know that system's safe. If you need access, you got to tell me why I need to expose it to you. So it is a very critical part, identity.
I got to tell you that being able to do support forensics analysis is one of the reasons that we felt that these PAM solutions was an important capability to provide, right? DHS had been doing this for years, and there was experience with it. And what we learned is that you can actually do some recording of if you suspect you have a real critical asset, you need to know what's going on, so you can check after the fact what happened. You can turn on recording and observe and monitor all the activities that happens for this transactional capability, and then you can go back later and view it, or even you can produce it as a record of what occurred. And I'm not trying to say it's appropriate for every place, but in the context you mentioned here, it's highly appropriate for that purpose, right?
And what I found with breaches is it really exposes what you don't know. It exposes the tools you don't have. It exposes all the things that, I worry about. When a breach happens, it immediately, puts me on my toes and say, you know what, we have to fix all of these things before the next breach. From policy to, training to everything, your infrastructure really does expose things when something happens. We're dealing with a couple of things like that now, and it's alarming to know that we didn't know who was doing what to our systems.
Yeah, I think in a perfect world, and I talk to customers about what's your utopia a lot, and I have this utopia of how things should work, and God, it would be nice if it did, and we're getting there. The tools are there. It's a matter of the implementation. But if you think of a privileged user that checks out the root account from a PAM appliance through an encapsulated session that they've logged in with their PIV or CAT card, we have non-repudiation on the authentication, the authorization. We've granted that access. We have traction. We have a way to track the access history. Who approved that access? It's all there. They go in, they log in, they do something they're not supposed to. The PAM tool kicks the session out, drops it into Splunk. Splunk sends Identity IQ or SailPoint an alert. We take action on it. We disable the rest of their accounts. What they did was risky. It was out of bands. Lots of different things you could do.
That's exactly what we're going to implement at CBP.
Outstanding.
So we use both tools. We use CyberArk. Yep. But to your point, when somebody does something they're not supposed to do, they need to be operating within the realm of CyberArk for us to be able to flag it and have the tool do something about it, or at least shut it down. So you can if you have walk-around access, you are a threat. And one way to mitigate that is to make sure that everything that's happening from a privileged user standpoint is happening within a tool that's watching that session and can flag it and can do something about it. So that's where we're going with at
And I
CDP.
want to talk a little bit about, go back to the first question you asked about stakeholder engagement. When CDM was considering what kind of tools, and by the way, CDM, the integrators on CDM bring the tool suggestion to us. They're the ones that say, these are the tools we think you ought to do. We don't select the tools, the integrators bring them to us. We had CyberArk was presented to us, and we wanted to make sure that this was a tool that we could use for privilege access management. We collaborated with the ICAM subcommittee in the FICAM office, right, to make sure that this kind of capability was a capability we wanted to do, because NIST called these capabilities, they had them in a transitional kind of a manner in a white paper they wrote, because it wasn't directive authentication to the device, right? But when we talked to them about all these extra mitigating controls and the visibility it can provide and the auditing capabilities it can provide, everybody agreed that these kind of tools are actually highly valuable in the environment, these vaulting tools. And they can be implemented quickly and they can be implemented effectively, right? That was those were important dynamics. And it was only by collaboration with other stakeholders that we came to that agreement, and that really helps, right? And we've been using it at DHS for a long time. So, yeah. Sorry.
Thanks, Ross.
Well, took me back, right?
So we kind of touched on this, but we have a few minutes left, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. We've talked a lot about zero trust today, and we've talked a lot about the ICAM modernization policy, and the perimeters coming down, and we're changing the way we're granting access. How is this going to affect the daily business? What impact is it going to have on the end user in your organization? What impact is it going to have on audit and compliance? I mean, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but this attribute-based access control and temporary access that Darren was talking about earlier, that could create an audit issue, Angel, right? Am I correct? Am I wrong? I'd love to hear your opinion on how this new paradigm shift in security is going to affect us, and leave that with our final thoughts for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I would tell you it's a transformational age, right? Meaning key stakeholder is critical, right? And it's change. It's change in the ecosystem. It's change not only for the enterprise, also for the auditors. We've said it over and over again, collaboration is going to be key, right? Collaboration and patience, understanding that, you're not going to be able to plug and play from day one and all your answers or questions are going to be answered. Knowing that it's a journey, so it will take a lot of hard work, a lot of lessons learned. It's going to take leadership to, continue to push the boundary, to lean in and to support. And from an auditor perspective, it's going to be an educational piece, because we're going to have to also understand what the new technology, how does it get implemented, who has access to it, right? What went into consideration as the new processes went into place? What was the shift? Was there any risk between the manual process and these new tools? So ultimately, at the end of the day, I would tell you collaboration at the forefront has to be there. If we're talking about the audit, I've said it already. Look, really, your auditor should be someone that you can have a conversation about these emerging technologies, this risk. They should be bringing you insights as to what risks they're seeing with other agencies, even on the commercial side, right? Because again, at the end of the day, access is access, risk is risk, whether you're on the federal side or on the commercial sector. So it's a team sport. I would tell you, frankly, my 2 cents. If we're going to make any progress, I think the collaboration has to be even stronger.
I think one of the factors here is, it's going to require yet another level of partnering and standardization and communication with mission partners. I think mission partners are a core of the reason why we're taking the path that we are with DoD. And I mean, DoD doesn't do anything by itself anywhere. That's the truth. So we need to make sure that our federal partners, our allies, our DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, and vendor suppliers, we have to all protect information together in order to get the job done right. But that requires that we all sort of support broad consensus of standards that support the level of information sharing and working end to end, right? ICAM is 3 concentric life cycles around identity, credentials, and then access management. When we bring stuff into into that paradigm and be explicit like we are with identity and access management with things that haven't been a part of that conversation, I think we're going to have to treat things in a more consistent way, and we're going to have to make sure that we're all sort of working towards the same objectives. And that's harmonization of a lot of business processes that, frankly, are somewhat uncomfortable for folks who've been used to doing things their own way in order to interoperate in this environment and protect information from the significant threats that we have. We'll see how we do.
The one thing we have done is I came from implementing applications in the cloud to work with Brian. So I had a team of geek boys, and when we start talking about CyberArk and you're not getting your 24/7 access, oh my goodness, I had a different name than Diana. But we took their input. Brian and I sit with them. We talked to one of the geek boys yesterday afternoon. Tell me what your pain point is. Tell me why you don't want to do this. Now, they've all been security educated, so they're like, okay, I can't tell you inconvenience because that's not a security thing. So if you listen to how they have to do their job, we have Border Patrol agents on ATVs and they're on horses and some are walking. They have a mission to do every day. I can sit here in DC and push pencils and say, you're not doing this, this, and this, but it's not my life on the line on the southern border or any one of our other borders. So you have to listen. We invite Border Patrol agents to come talk to us. We invite field support people to come and talk to us, airport people. Tell us, this is what we have to do. What can't you live with and why? Because we have to support the business. We have to support the mission. So it is a collaboration, and like you said, bring it to a different level. To say, okay, everybody sit down and say, we're here to do the same thing. But feedback is we invite it some days.
Some days.
We are 13 seconds left. So I'm going to open up the panel, or open up for questions.
Maybe. Let's see.
Hi, I'm Jay Masron with the SBA. I used to be in the auditor world, specifically with DCA, so I have 3 questions to you, sir. Number 1, with the advanced automated systems today, can you talk about statistical sampling and also risk assessment using systems, because I know it's changed over the past few years. Question number 2, with legacy systems, especially because I did work under a DoD agency, there's so many different systems out there, legacy systems, and especially when they're modifying, they're upgrading systems, it's a very challenge for auditors, and talk about that. And thirdly, I've heard, I don't know if I would say it's a rumor, that financial institutions, in particular, say full-fledged FDIC banks, are not relying on audits of loan applicants. They're looking at MAS, Management Advisory Service. If you could comment on those 3 questions. And I want to thank all of the panel members for a stimulating conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. So just to recap the question on the first one is what sampling approach are we using to tackle the audits? Absolutely, data analytics is a big part of our audit approach in the beginning. I would tell you in probably 10 years ago, that wasn't really the thing. Now we're looking at where does the data, where's the most risk, where do we see the outliers? That's where we start the approach. So absolutely something that we're doing from a planning and sampling perspective. The second one, legacy systems and the challenges for the audit. Absolutely. Look, I think that's something that, and I'm glad you asked that question, right? Because these are legacy systems that were built, very, very long time ago. And in reality, to no one's fault, they just kept evolving with really no true documentation behind it. So it is a tremendous challenge for us on legacy systems, just because we're ultimately looking to trace the data And sometimes really no one has the answer. And it's not because we don't have the most brightest individuals at that organization. It was just the way it was done, 30 years ago, and then it was developed over and over and over again. As far as the financial services area, frankly, I haven't heard of that rumor, whether they're relying on the audits or not. But I will come back to something that Frank mentioned, data breaches and audits. Look, the audit itself should not equate to a secure enterprise. Right? I think we have this misconception sometimes that, hey, if we comply with this regulation, we're doing better. At the end of the day, I come back to, you should be doing good business processes, supporting the mission. Through that, the audit results are just the byproduct.
Well, thank you very much. I think this has been an outstanding panel.